Hello, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. We're going to get started. My name is Tess Lorman. I'm a bookseller here, and I'm pleased to be introducing tonight's speaker. Tonight, we will be hearing from Gregory Orfalea about his latest book, Journey to the Sun, Junípero Serra and the Founding of California. Mr. Orfalea is a Californian himself and has been a teacher of writing in Southern California at the Claremont Colleges and at Westmont College, as well as here in D.C. at Georgetown University. In fact, before the event, he informed me that Westmont College has asked him to head up a new Center of California Studies, so congratulations. You may recognize his name if you live nearby, as Mr. Orfalea does, or if you're a Politics and Prose regular. In 2010, Mr. Orfalea introduced us to his first collection of short stories, The Man Who Guarded the Bomb. That year, he was also honored with the Arab American Book Award and was named a finalist for the PEN USA Award in Creative Writing for Angelino Days, an Arab American writer on family, place, and politics. He's now turned his considerable talent to California history, revisiting the legacy of the Majorcan monk whose perseverance led to the founding of the Catholic missions from the tip of Baja California to San Francisco, each no more than a day's walk from the next. And 300 years after Father Serra's birth, there is no more appropriate time to take an in-depth yet imaginative look at the man himself and how he came to shape the lives of so many. Mr. Orfalea, welcome back to Politics and Prose.
Does that work? Louder. Eileen is always telling me louder. Except when I'm angry. Then it's quieter. Who is God's companion? Junípero Serra might have contemplated this thought on the road in the Salinas Valley of California in 1771, where he met an Indian woman who offered him a present. When he asked her name, she murmured Soledad, Spanish for solitude, or at least that's what he heard. I was astonished, and turning to my companion said, "Here, gentlemen, you have Maria de la Soledad." He gave her glass beads for seeds. She nodded. As the name stuck to the place, Serra made a note to found a mission in that desolate, treeless spot. Soledad later became the most hard-luck mission of all founded on the coast. Serra had undergone plenty of solitude, the soledad of the trail, the one that surrounded your neck like water at night. A soledad to conquer by singing matins before first light. Not English or American solitude, which celebrated being on one's own, without others. Spanish soledad, which longed for them. Serra was not about soledad. Neither were the Franciscan fathers. He'd swallowed his fill of it as a boy, losing 2 sisters and a brother, working the quiet fields of Petra, his home village on the Spanish island of Majorca. But his father's leather hand was always on his shoulder, and later his confreres' abrazos. Even those strangers in the confessional cut Soledad with their pain. Serra respected the solitude Christ felt in the garden, that last night of his life when the apostles slept. But Serra wasn't Simon of the desert standing on a pillar alone. He loved community, loved performing marriages. He traveled as much as he could in a pair or a group, because outside the mission walls lay a solitude so vast only the sun could disperse it. Now the dew was on the leaf, the earth shorn briefly of dust, dark and lovely and cool. The sun began its climb of the Santa Lucia Mountains, casting them in gray outline. As his mule snorted, taking him north in the early morning, the sun regarded Serra. He dared not look back. The sun, warm on his forehead, rising over the crown of the forest, now arched in his mind above the Tramontana range of his old island and its olive groves to the sea. The Mediterranean waded into the Pacific. The sun wrapped the world in its arms. Who was God's companion? He was. For a second, he looked at the sun. God put a white spot in his eye. Well, forgive me if I seem a little dotty tonight. I just got in on the red eye from Los Angeles. I had to change my flight due to a memorial service for a good friend of mine and colleague out there, Jarvis Streeter, a professor at Cal Lutheran University, who was a sweet man who died of pancreatic cancer a couple weeks ago. So I changed my flight, and I'm glad I did. Jarvis, like so many of us writers, gave his life to write something, and it's not published, and it may never be published. It's a great life's work. It's called God and the History of the Universe. You can't have a more important title. And I don't know, it's not going to be easy. I pledged to him I would try and get it published for him. But he reconciles God with science. And these were his two specialties, and it's a gargantuan task, and we miss him already. It's good to be here. It's good to be at Politics and Prose again. Thanks. You know, my adopted city, to be here with a book that sort of captured my life 12 years ago about my real home in California, to present this to you and to introduce to you someone that is not well known here is a real pleasure for me. I want to thank, or do this in a sense in the memory of Carla Cohen, who founded this store, with thanks also to Barbara Mead and, of course, the new owners, Brad and Lissa Muscatine. Thank you. Yeah, it was a long journey getting here, 12 years. And involved, running up blind alleys in Oaxaca. I went to Mexico and Spain 5 times to hunt down what I hoped to be some new material from Father Serra. And indeed, I was able to get a couple of new letters, find some new letters. We only have 6 letters of Father Serra's for the first 54 years of his life from Spain through Mexico. And then we have 264 letters for his life in Alta California. So you have this strange problem of document poor first half of the life, first 2/3 of the life, and document rich last third. And it was a bit of a research challenge. But I was able to find 2 letters no one had ever found before in a gorge high up in the Sierra Gorda in Mexico. So if we had 6 before he gets to California, and we now have 2 more, which sounds like nothing. That's a 33% increase. The manuscript was 1,300 pages at one point. My editor just hacked away, asked my agent's wife to hack away. My wife hacked away. I mean, we all took our turns, and there was blood all over the floor. But we managed to get it down. That little piece I just read you is the prologue, actually. It's 1 page. And 1 page took us 3 weeks to whittle down from maybe 10. I wrote the book in large part to dispel 2 myths that have to do with the founding of our country. The first has to do with Thanksgiving and the actual question of who got here when. We are taught that the original Thanksgiving took place with the Pilgrims in Massachusetts in 1621. But in fact, there was a Thanksgiving Mass celebrated by the Spaniards in St. Augustine, Florida, in 1565. And even earlier than that, nearly a century before, the Spanish explorer Cabrillo visited California in 1542, sharing gifts with the Kumeyaay of San Diego before he fell in a crevasse on San Miguel Island, one of the 4 Channel Islands, and maybe the first, not entirely sure, European buried in what became the United States. Possibly someone from the Coronado expedition in Arizona may have been one too. In 1769, 7 years before our country's created, Junípero Serra said his own first Thanksgiving Mass on entering San Diego, leading Europeans into an area populated by 220,000 Indians, now a state with a population of 37 million, including 3 times as many Native Americans as existed then. The original Spanish conquest of the West stands in contrast to the founding story of the East, that of the Anglo-Puritan and Protestant, upon which a 200-year-old civilization has been founded. That prevalent story, the founding of the story of the East, that is generally looked upon as the founding of our whole country, looked upon material wealth as a sign of faith. In religious matters, it elevated pure spirit over the sullied and often artistic flesh. But the foundation story of the West, that is Spanish Catholic, is distinctly anti-materialistic, unabashedly colorful and sensual, mystical in its approach to the natural world, and more complicated and enriched with its blood ties by Aboriginal peoples. All of this emerges in the complex life of Junípero Serra, a life of great weight to Californians who study him in the 4th grade by law. Now, let's see. I think Tess said, where did you study him, Tess? I mean, which mission project did you do?
I did Mission Santa Clara.
Mission Santa Clara, a good one. The only one that exists today on a university campus. I did Mission San Juan Capistrano. In fact, it's the earliest memory I have in my life. 2.5 years old, a bird came walking on my underarm and took bird seed from my hand, and for years I thought it was a swallow, because that's the myth, right? The swallows come back to Capistrano on March 19th, the feast day of St. Joseph. Well, I took a close look at the picture because my mother ordered me to, and it was a pigeon. Pretty close. But these are the sort of myths, you have to confront in writing this book. Anyone else here brought up in California did a mission project? Anyone? Which mission? Do you remember?
I don't remember. I just remember using sugar cubes to make the entire
Right.
glue.
I remember that too. Someone else I saw with a hand up? Abby, did you do a mission project, Abby? No.
I did, Greg, but I don't remember what it
Yeah, Pat?
Our daughter was married in Carmel.
Oh.
Father Sarah's
Yeah.
married.
He is buried there alongside Father Crespi, his friend, and Father Lasuen, Firmin Lasuen, who took over after him and founded the last, well, not all of the last 12, but 9 of the last 12. Sarah did 9, Lasuen did 9, and then there were 3 more that were each done by a single priest. Yeah, it's just, it was motivating to me, having been here half my life and knowing that when I bring up the name Sarah, I had one person say, "Oh, are you writing about Abraham's wife in the Old Testament?" I said, No, not Abraham. Somebody else. All right, I said 2 myths. I came to write this book in no small part to dispel 2 myths. The second myth is actually 2-sided and governed the entire journey to uncover Sarah's real life. And that is that on the one hand, he's either an unmitigated saint, or on the other hand, he's guilty of genocide. Well, that's a pretty big swing. But that encompasses, really, the attitudes of most people. There's almost nothing in the middle. these opposed visions have dominated consideration of Serra for nearly 300 years. But a person is a person, full of good and bad, the inspired and the regrettable, if not embarrassing. To me, Serra's extraordinarily dramatic, richly complicated life deserved better, or I wouldn't have given 12 years of it to pursue his over 3 continents. All right, I'm going to summarize the facts of his life. I assume for most of you who haven't been brought up in California that much of this will be new, and for some of you who were brought up in California, perhaps there will be some surprises. And then once I do this, we'll do a sprinkling of a piece from Spain, Mexico, and California, and then we'll open up to questions and answers. You can ask me the hard ones too. Floggings. I'm ready. Miguel Serra, actually Miquel Serra, Miquel. He was Mallorquin, and that's the Mallorquin or Catalan spelling of Miguel. Was born on the Spanish island of Majorca in 1713. The year the War of Spanish Succession, which involved most of the powers of Europe, came to a bitter end. Majorca was a fiercely independent island of an already fiercely independent Catalonia, which now came under the control of the French Bourbons. Serra was born to a poor farmer with whom he worked in the wheat fields, the olive and almond groves. Despite being asthmatic and small, I think on exhumation they measured his skeleton at 5'2", this boy was tough. He also learned that almond trees, which in Mallorquin are called the amatillas, burst with white flowers in the coldest month of January, this month, sending light across the whole island. And Eileen and I and Luke, too, who I am so glad is here today, as well as so many wonderful neighbors, came with me when we started this journey, this serious journey, maybe about 5-6 years ago, to Mallorca in January. Great time to go, by the way, because the hotels are cheap. And the amatilla flowers just light up that island. It is gorgeous. Everywhere you go, there's this snow in the trees of light. 3 of Serra's siblings died in infancy, including an earlier Miguel, for whom he was named. Only one sibling, a sister Juana, survived. There is more than a little evidence he had both Arab and Jewish blood in him. Now this sounds amazing, but it's really not that amazing for Spaniards. 30% of Spaniards have either Jewish or Arab blood, and often both, due to the history of Spain and the conquering in 711 of Ibn Zayd of 3/4 of Spain when he came across Gibraltar. And, of course, the expulsion of Jews from eastern Mediterranean, and they came wading across most of the Mediterranean, and many settled in Spain. So you have this double heritage for many Spaniards. Serra was, in fact, a replacement child. Schooled by the Franciscans, he entered Franciscan seminary at 15 and was ordained a priest in Palma, that's the capital of the island, around the age of 25. And Maynard Geiger, who wrote the last major biography in 1959, Father Geiger says this is one of the great mysteries of Serra's life. We don't know the exact date of his ordination. It's very unusual because that's one of the most, if not the most, dates in a priest's life, and it seems likely he was ordained alone, which is also strange because ordination is a group affair. Among Serra's theological models were Duns Scotus, the medieval philosopher who believed art provided a way to God. How many of you have seen the missions in California? Oh, good. Great. Yeah. Oh, great. Yeah, they're just filled with gorgeous art. Just so many pieces. I actually I just went through, much of the state on 10 different stops in Carmel and San Luis Obispo, San Rafael, bookstores and missions, and Google even. And I presented not just this talk or some version of it, but also images of the paintings and the artwork, which are stunning. Just to give you one, if you're in Carmel around Christmas, we'll try and go to Carmel around Christmas. There is a painting that is taken out for only 1 week a year that Serra or one of his confreres brought to Carmel, probably from Mexico. It's a copy of a work called The Visitation. And it's a painting of Mary holding and embracing St. Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist. And it's a copy of a great painting in the Uffizi by Albertinelli. But this is a really beautiful painting and very rare, even as a copy. And they only take it out for 1 week at Christmas. Worth seeing. I'm mentioning his models. The second was St. Bonaventure, for which Mission San Bonaventura in Ventura is named, whose mystical attachment to Christ's suffering on the cross Serra intimated in his recommendation for improvement to all of a wealth of sufferings. Serra felt that suffering was a riches and should be embraced. Probably easier said than done by most of us in this pain-adverse culture. But for him, it was a way of following Christ's suffering on the cross. And Bonaventure really used that worldview as critical to his view of Christianity, the crucifixion, as a way to God. Maria de Agreda, who has ever heard of Maria de Agreda? Anyone? It's amazing. Not one person in California had ever heard of her. I certainly hadn't heard of her before I started this journey. Maria de Agreda was a 17th century Spanish nun who wrote a 4-volume novel about Mary. Now, how many women were writing novels in the 17th century? Any novels. And how many were doing 4 volumes on this sacred figure? It is really something. Believe me, I don't understand it. I tried, and I still try. I had a copy of her book on the bedstead during the whole time. In fact, I had 3 books that I always have a couple of books that kind of bolster me by the bedstead while I'm writing a book. One was Maria de Agreda's Mystical City of God. One was Don Quixote. And one was Lauren Hillenbrand's Unbroken, which taught me a lot about how to move a story along with a lot of detail, with a lot of material, a lot of freight. Well, Maria de Agreda, besides the fact of her writing this uncanny book, which got her examined by the Inquisition, by the way, claimed to bilocate from Agreda, Spain to New Mexico 500 times. And I say in the book, that's a spiritual frequent flyer if there ever was one. We'll leave to your question and answers anything more you want to know about her. She's a mystifying and fascinating figure, important for our story because Serra carried only 3 things in his knapsack that he used as reading material: the Bible, his divine office, and Maria de Agreda. So she was important to him. Finally, of course, St. Francis of Assisi. No Franciscan cannot be attached to St. Francis, who made, by the way, a rather tragic peace mission to the Muslims of North Africa. I have no doubt in my mind that Serra saw the Indians of California as his Moors. Certainly the most bookish of conquistadors, Serra, over time, ascended to the chair in theology at the Lullian University in Palma, Majorca. He gave sermons all over the island that some said should be printed in gold. He was revered. He also himself was investigated by the Inquisition, and he inspected books for it as a commissario. Double heritage there. For all his small island world fame, he threw it away in 1749 at the age of 36, probably middle-aged in the 18th century to go to the New World and minister to Indians. Sadly and frustratingly for a biographer, we have only one extant letter of Serra's before he left Spain, of his Spanish life, and it's his goodbye letter to his parents, which, by the way, he could not even write to them. He was so ashamed of leaving them, basically knowing he would never come back, leaving him in their old age, that he couldn't write the goodbye letter to them. He wrote it to a cousin and said, take it to them. Serra spent 18 years in Mexico, 15 in California, so actually his largest chunk was in Mexico. And I just had a great time unearthing his life in Mexico. It's fascinating. Anybody here been to the 5 churches he created in the Sierra Gorda? Oh, that's worth a trip too. They're a World Heritage Site. They're sort of higher up in the world history ledger than the California missions. And the reason is their facades are so beautiful. They're cut with all kinds of figures. Maria de Agreda herself is in the mission at Landa with Duns Scotus, and they're sitting at desks and look like they're talking to each other. Now, where do you see philosophers cut into the facades of a Catholic church? It's fascinating. Also, a hairless dog, Zola, of the Aztecs, is right alongside the Christian symbol of a lion. This is highly unusual. So I recommend you to recommend those missions to you in the Sierra Gorda. In 1768, in order to head off the Russians and replace the Jesuits who had just been expelled from Baja, Serra was sent by Spain to California, which many maps at the time pictured as an island. California was thought of as an island, and it was represented as an island on maps till the middle of the 18th century. In 1769, he was the first European to enter and stay in Alta California, founding San Diego as the first of 9 missions. He took up residence in San Carlos Borromeo and Carmel, his home till he died in 1784 at the age of 71. As he told his parents in his goodbye letter, and I'm quoting, a happy death is the most important thing in this life. For if we reach that goal, it matters little if we lose all the rest. But if we do not reach it, nothing else will have mattered. But Serra's last night did not start happy. He confessed, and I'm quoting, this is from his last night, I have come under the shadow of fear. Serra logged 14,000 miles in the New World by ship, mule, and at least 1,000 of them by foot. Now, I think, Tess, you mentioned 1 day walk from mission to mission. Actually, that's kind of one of the myths that you come to, and I was taught it as well. But in actuality, it's 1 day horse ride. It'll take 3 days to walk between the missions, and of course, as they are today, not as they were, because he didn't have it all filled in. He baptized or confirmed 6,000 Indians. Over 100,000 would be baptized by 1834 when the missions were secularized. Despite several Indian attacks on the missions, the aberrant practice of disciplinary floggings, and the tragic decimation by germs, there were still 150,000 Indians in California at the time of the gold rush. So it had dropped, and part of this, a lot of it was due to germs, but it wasn't really precipitous till the Americans came. By 1860, which is 12 years after the American gold rush, there were only 30,000 Indians. So a huge drop from 150 to 30,000. All right, just some quick glimpses and then Q&A. Would you like to know why he picked the name Junípero? It's kind of interesting. He was a very serious person. If he had humor, it was more like the humor of an academician, kind of acidic and stinging, mildly ironic, maybe not mildly. He wasn't a burlesque kind of figure, but Junípero was. Junípero was that's the Spanish version of Brother Juniper, who was the closest person to Saint Francis of Assisi. So why does he pick Brother Juniper as his namesake? And who was this man? Well, Brother Juniper was, in the best sense of the word, crazy. His antics included cutting off silver bells from the altar cloth at the main Franciscan monastery and giving them away to a beggar woman, walking half naked in the marketplace with a bundle of clothes on his head, going silent for 6 months, and cooking a meal for the friars he thought would last a fortnight, all in one giant pot. Juniper threw in several live chickens without plucking them, dozens of eggs in their shells. Repelled, the friars rebuked Juniper for wasting so much food. Juniper answered humbly, smiling ear to ear, that he was just trying to save time. Then he prostrated himself, begging them to cut out his eyes and hang him before he walked merrily away. The emblematic story of Brother Juniper, however, concerns the pig's foot. And this, by the way, these are wonderful tales of St. Francis called the Fioretti. I recommend them to anyone. One day a friar, racked by painful illness, was asked by Juniper if there was anything he could get him to ease his pain. "Oh, for a tasty pig's foot," the friar said. Brother Juniper did not waste time. He grabbed a butcher's knife from the priest's kitchen, took off to a local wooded area where some pigs were foraging, and promptly cut off a foot. He ran back with the bloody stump, cooked it, salted it, gave it to the fellow monk in his agony, who ate it with avidity, to Juniper's delight. The swineherd, however, was not impressed. He'd seen the apparently mindless butchery and ran to tell the lord of the estate, who soon followed the bloody trail to the Franciscan monastery and gave Francis a piece of his mind. For Francis, whose love of justice was acute, this was one prank too many. Apologizing, Juniper flung himself on the man's neck and embraced him, an inspired Groucho. The Lord was so moved, he gave the entire pig to the monks, who themselves had one fine ham roast. Would to God, my brethren, that I had a forest of such junipers, Francis sighed. No surprise there is neither date nor place of birth for Brother Juniper. Such people seem to have lit down from the sky. It was a blithe spirit young Sarah hoped to call on. I should mention that when Sarah arrived in Mexico City after he walked from Veracruz, that was a good long walk of 250 miles, the guardian, the head Franciscan in Mexico City, greeted him with, "Oh, if I only had a forest of such junipers." All right, quickly now. Mexico. Actually, I think I'll summarize this and then just read one more. The summary situation in Mexico is I did discover some extraordinary things in Oaxaca. I discovered through a confession, a record of a confession, that Sarah heard the confession during a mission in Oaxaca of a woman who was having a 14-year affair with a married man since she was 14. So she was 28 when she made the confession. Sarah, was a little startled, but of course, when you're a confessor, you hear just about everything under the sun. So he was going to give her absolution, and she said, "Father, that's not enough." And he said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "My lover is going to kill me and kill himself if I don't come back to him." In other words, by going to confession, she was risking her life. So Sarah suddenly is not just a confessor here. He's faced with more important things than just sin and no sin, but life and death consideration. He got her a room in a safe house with an older woman of Oaxaca. He basically shielded her from the man, but the man would not be denied, and he took a rope one night, ran up to the safe house window, yelled up to the woman to come down. When she wouldn't, he threw the rope up. It hooked onto one of those iron bars and he hung himself. So this is quite a story, and it's referred to in a 1787 biography of Serra by his best friend Francisco Palou, one of his best friends. And it's just dropped. There are no names in it. Father Geiger in 1959 hardly mentions it. I think he mentions it in one sentence, and I thought, wow, there's something there. So I spent a while in Oaxaca, and I was very frustrated for several days, but finally I got the name of the man. His name was Don Matias Cortabarria, and with his name I ran around to 5 archives, and there's nothing like an archivist who's onto something. They really help you out. Oh, they're so excited, and they are the secret sharers of this book. We were able to find out the name of the woman. Her name is probably Maria Contreras Ibergoa, and I was able to stitch together a story, their story. Okay, finally, and then for your questions. People ask me, what's the central moment of Serra's life? Radical mercy. A radical mercy at San Diego. And I'll read you just a short bit of this rather dramatic moment. Serra was not in San Diego when it was attacked on November 4th, 1775. He was in Carmel. That was his home mission. So it took several weeks for the word of the attack to get to him. The attack occurred with the Kumeyaay, and they basically killed 3 Spaniards, one of whom was one of Serra's best friends and was a priest named Father Luis Jaime, who loved them very much and was probably the kindest friar in California. But he was killed. So Serra sat down in the wake of the second major Indian uprising in California to write a soul-searching letter to Viceroy Bucareli in Mexico City. He contemplated the burned, shredded baptismal records, the stolen vestments and utensils of the sacristy. He hovered on giving up. He reminded Bucareli of his insistence at the beginning of these conquests that, quote, in case the Indians, whether pagans or Christians, would kill me, they should be pardoned. From the very outset of the Spanish movement into Alta California, Serra seemed to sense violence was inevitable, and he wasn't going to return it, nor did he want the military to return it. Serra's insistent note to Bucareli was not only exceptional in its anticipatory mercy, it seemed to beg the question of the whole enterprise. This is a stunning position. It's almost as if Serra were asking forgiveness not only for the Indian, but from him, knowing what the Indian was going to have to give up, even if he felt he was offering a better way, salvation as he understood it. He asked for clemency, and he tackled it simply and profoundly. And I'll end with this exact quote from his letter to Viceroy Bucareli. To prevent the Indians from killing others, let the soldiers protect us in better fashion than they did the now deceased Padre. And as to the killer, let him live so that he can be saved. For that is the purpose of our coming here, and its sole justification. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the gospel of love. Thanks. All right. Any questions?
If you do have questions, please remember to use the microphones on either side.
Right. I've done that myself many times, Tess. Yes.
Several years ago, is this on? Several years ago, we were living in Barcelona and visited Mallorca, and as we were driving through Petra, saw the sign, birthplace of
Wonderful. Yeah.
Serra. We were with 2 friends. Also, 3 of the 4 of us had spent 4th grade in California.
Uh-huh.
So
Right.
we spent the rest of the time talking about what we remembered. Now, we were in 4th grade in the 50s.
Right. Right.
You talked about these 2 opposing views of
Yeah.
Mother Serra.
Yep.
We only heard
One
one
side.
side.
Sure.
There was absolutely nothing about the effects of empire and religion on Alta California.
Of course.
And I'm wondering, with your experience in California studies now, what is the state of the message or the curriculum for the fourth graders?
Well, it's still pretty sanitized. I have to confess, I haven't looked at it in a while, but my memory of it is that it is fairly sanitized. I don't think it deals with the floggings, which is the dark side of the whole story, and Sarah's blind spot. I mean, I will take the opportunity to say just straight out, the floggings were wrong. There's just no way to gainsay it. You can talk about the fact that, practices in that time in terms of discipline were common. There were common thrashings, and even in England, they would give 4 thrashes were called a scrubbing, 6 were a bibling for students at Eton, the great prep school of England. Parents paid a guinea for a thrashing fee. So, I mean, discipline by the whip was common in those days, but that doesn't excuse it. It's against the 5th commandment,
For those
and I
of
think
us
it's wrong.
from other places, I mean, I grew up in New England.
Yeah.
So this is all news to me.
Oh, really? Okay.
What were the circumstances of the flogging, and who was flogged and what for?
Well, Spaniards were flogged as well as Indians. Oftentimes the floggings were done for theft, for adultery, and sometimes when one of the Indians was, having sexual relations with someone else's wife, or vice versa. There were sometimes floggings were given when the Indians ran off out of the mission without permission and didn't come back. Now, people have used that as a leverage for the argument that this was slavery. This is not true. There's no historian of any repute in California or anywhere else that would say that the missions were slavery, because the Indians were not forced into it. They came in of their own volition. Now, they came in for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they came in out of total frustration and devastation because their villages people were dying off in their villages, or there were famine. There wasn't enough food. The missions had food. They had shelter. This was a bit of a double-edged sword, because once they came into the missions, some of the rooms were so close. The Monjerio was where the women's dormitory, that sometimes the germs were spread more quickly. So it was just a terrible situation with these microbes. One thing about the floggings to keep in mind, they were the ones that were given the Indians were about half as long as the norm, because the Indians were considered children. So they were flogged as if they were given less floggings. This doesn't sound good, doesn't make it good, but it is mitigated somewhat by the fact that they were far less than were given others. Serra loved the Indians. I think he did it as discipline. It was not to be done out of anger. In fact, if it was done out of anger, the priest who did it that way was sanctioned himself and was considered to be guilty of mortal sin. This is spelled out in the regulations. It's a tough issue, and no one can approach his story by avoiding it. But I had a Berkeley professor, a Berkeley theologian, Father Kenan Osborne, who's a Franciscan out at Santa Barbara Mission, tell me, if you write a totally honorific biography of Father Serra, it won't be good. He just said it won't be good. So tell it like it is. And I tried to do that.
Hi. Is this on?
It should be.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, sounds
Yeah,
good.
thank you. I used to be an altar boy at the San Luis Rey de Francia.
Oh, great mission.
Yeah, I loved it.
Yeah.
In fact, in the early 60s, a member of my family was asked to write kind of like a dramatic thing for celebration of the mission. It was one of the big anniversaries.
Yeah.
And I remember she said she researched the library, and there was little good that she could find to celebrate, from the historical, which I thought was odd. That's why I was so curious about your
Yeah.
But there was just not that much material that apparently was available at the time there. I don't know why that. And I'm curious about but my real question, and
Yeah.
that's a side question,
Sure.
is I think about the Jesuits and the missions, particularly in Paraguay and in the Chaco, that area.
Right.
How do you compare their approach? Did you look into that when you were doing research for your book?
Yeah, actually, that's interesting. You anticipated something I wanted to know. And the whole book to me is sort of my own self-education. Because, my background is literature. I'm not a history guy, although I've written history. So I had to really do a lot of research over 12 years to get myself up to snuff, and I often thought that I wasn't up to the task. My editor really spent a lot of time bolstering me in the first year or so. But to your question about comparing, I have a whole chapter called New World Others that sort of goes the gamut, covers the whole, covers the bases as much as one can in one chapter of evangelism with Indians in North America. Not as much in South America, although I'm aware. I think you've all maybe seen the movie The Mission. Yeah. It's a great movie. It is a stunning movie. And in a lot of ways, it's the story of Serra, particularly in San Diego. I think Serra stacks up pretty well when compared to the heroic missionaries of, say, Peru that are described in the movie The Mission, particularly at that time. I mean, he defended them many times, put his own hide at risk, so to speak. The molestation of Indian women by soldiers occurred almost from the beginning, and he was outraged by it and kept asking the comandante, Pedro Fages, to dismiss people, to just throw them out of the territory if they had done such things. And he wouldn't do it. The comandante did discipline. So Serra went all the way to Mexico City in 1774 and got Fages cashiered by the viceroy. He says, if he doesn't leave, I'm leaving. He's not disciplining the soldiers who are molesting the women. And he spoke out against it many, many times. So in that sense, then what I read you about the Mercy in San Diego occurred in more than one time. He called the leader of the rebellion, whose name was Chisley, or Carlos in Spanish, a Kumeyaay Indian. He said, how is he doing? He wrote in a letter to the governor, he's part of my family, because he was now up in Carmel.
I have, well, can I throw another quick one?
A follow-up? Sure, go ahead.
Father de las Casas and his whole process. Yeah. There was a woman whose name eludes me. She used to be a neighbor in Berkeley, who did years of research on de las Casas, but also on Junípero.
Oh, great.
And on the issue about the rights of the Indians. She's long dead now. But
don't know that writer or theologian, but I do know Bartolomé de las Casas.
She was a historian at Berkeley. I can't remember.
The great 16th century critic of the Spanish conquest. There's a big difference, I think, between what the Spaniards did to the Aztecs through Cortés, through Columbus on Cuba or Hispaniola, and then also Pizarro in Peru, which was massacring. There was a sort of genocide that occurred there. But don't forget, Serra is 250 years later, and I believe it's my thesis that something was learned. He was the last conquistador, and I think at that point he had learned something. Actually, if I found another conquistador, if you will, or explorer that resembled Serra, I thought Samuel Champlain was similar, the Frenchman who went into the Northeast. His story is a very good biography of Champlain by David Hackett Fisher, the Pulitzer Prize winner. I'd recommend that to you. Sure.
I was on a congressional tour in California a good 15 years ago, and we stopped at one of the missions.
Yeah.
And I even moved this up.
There you go.
We stopped at one of the missions, and there was a diorama there of a village and something going on.
Sure.
And I, based on what was there, made the remark that the fathers had been pretty hard on the Indians, at which a very conservative right-wing House Committee counsel, I can't remember what, said to me, well, hell, how do you know how the Indians treated each other?
Oh,
which sort of was kind of an interesting reaction to that. So I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
Earlier in my life, I was stationed for a year in the public health service at Santa Vir del Bac. Father Kino
In Arizona.
in Arizona
Right.
mission. And they were also Franciscans.
Yes, sir.
Now, was there any difference in the way Father Serra and those missions developed, and the Father Kino and those missions developed? Was there any particular orientation that was different?
Well, I think Kino and also Father Garces, who was another Arizona Franciscan, Father Francisco Garces, who was martyred on the Colorado River between California and Arizona just before Serra died, were similar. I think they were similar. Father Kino was well known as being with the Pima Indian, the Odom, as they're called today in northern Arizona, being very solicitous and actually very interested in their traditions, and he would sit and listen to their stories because he knew the language for hours. A very loving priest, as was Father Garces. I think they're similar. I think they're similar in the sense that they were explorers, too. Father Garces is said to be the first white man to see the Grand Canyon from the west. He explored all over the Southwest. We have to be careful when you mention that, the Indians had trouble with themselves. Well, they did. I mean, I think we don't do Indian civilization any favors by sentimentalizing them. They're human life, like human life everywhere. They fought within each other. There was a sort of gauntlet that prisoners of war would run down in some of the tribes in California. Some prisoners of war weren't taken for very long. They just lost their head. There are other tribes that were much more gentle. I mean, there was great diversity of cultural influence. The gentleman here who said he had been an altar boy at San Luis Rey was one of the most successful missions because the Indians, the Luiseño, had worshipped a god called Wiat or Wyatt, who was very similar to Christ. He predicted his death, and that the death would be for others, for the good of others. The death actually was the secretion of a poison by a frog figure, so it wasn't crucifixion. But then he resurrected after and became the moon, Wyatt. It's not Christ, but there's some similarities. There's something similar in the story. And so the Luiseño was San Luis Rey was the largest mission of all. Had 3,000 Indians and was very prosperous and very serene, actually. I'm sorry? Were you finished answering the question? Yeah, I think so. Oh, Ernie had one more question. We have to take Ernie's question.
How
Last
close
question.
is the Vatican to bestowing sainthood on the Good Father?
A good way to end. The question is, how close is the Vatican to bestowing sainthood on Serra? Well, Serra is beatified. He was beatified by John Paul II in 1988. He has one miracle logged in his name of a nun that was cured of incurable lupus in St. Louis in the 1960s. You need 2 miracles to qualify for sainthood. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary. And there are lots of other things that are important. I think I asked the priest who's head of the Serra cause, Ernie, at Santa Barbara Mission, Father John Vaughn, what about this second miracle? He says, we're being very hard. We've had dozens of applicants, and we've gone over them all and turned them down because we don't want this to be a soft sort of thing. We need to know that this miracle is a miracle. There are a lot of people that are critical of Serra, and there are a lot of people who venerate him too. We want to make sure that we're on strong ground with a second miracle. So we're not there yet. Well, thank you all for coming.